All right, great day, Gadfly subscribers and new Gadfly listeners. If this is your first time tuning in to the Gadfly multi-channel network, welcome. This is CJ or Carlos, whichever you prefer. And I have a little bit of audio feed coming through, so bear with me for one moment. There we go. I had to shut that off. So again, our Gadfly multi-channel network is available at the gadfly.vhx.tv. And we do have a significant amount, a great team of contributors. You can go there. You can actually see we have the contributor discussions, which is several discussions that we typically do during the week. And we have several of those discussions each week. We also do a roundtable discussion. We also have Jim Willie with us from the Golden Jackass, London Paul of the Sears Report, Ken Shotgun Shortgun Jr. from Shotgun Economics, and Rory Hall of the Daily Coin. So please go there, check that out for our premium subscription-based system. And today I am joined by London Paul of the Sears Report, and you can find his work at thesearsreport.com. And then also Paul is very active on his Twitter handle as well, which is at the Sears Report. So Paul, good day. How are you today, sir?
Yes, I'm very well. How are you, CJ?
I'm doing great, Paul. We had our first Arctic blast here in the Midwest. So we had our first dumping of a little bit of snow mixed with a little bit of ice. It got extremely cold. And Paul, for now, global warming is going to be put on hold because tomorrow morning we're going to be breaking record lows of 9 degrees. So,
yeah, we actually had about an hour's snow on Saturday morning, which was quite interesting. It was extremely cold, but yeah, thank goodness for global warming, because if we didn't have this, it'd be horrendously cold. But all jokes aside, yeah. So, well, as ever, we have enormous amounts of things to discuss, and I cover them off individually, and we do them on the Gadfly. But there's something you sent to me, which I think is kind of indicative of a statement I made back in around March 2018 on my own podcast, when I said, well, Russia's been demonized for a long time by the West and by the US, but you're going to start to see this acceleration of the demonization of China. And we've discussed this many, many times on and off before. I have individually, and also we have collectively. But you highlighted an interview that was done, and we thought it was worth commenting on it, because I think it's got to the point now where the idea of what's going on in China simply doesn't marry up with reality. And I'm not suggesting China's a perfect nation by any stretch of the imagination. And there's a lot of things they need to improve, but there's a lot of things and accusations made against them which I think just don't stand up to scrutiny. But I'll let you sort of introduce that, obviously, because you found the clip, and you can just we'll
yes.
take it from there.
Well, Paul, we've had several discussions lately in regards to a lot of the alt media, the new media, as we once referred it to, and by far there's probably a handful of channels that now, who at one time were greatly critical of previous administrations, whether it was good, whether it was bad. However, again, with this new administration, that is kind of a situation where there's a lot of hesitation about either criticizing or pointing things out, and even at the point now where it's completely avoided. And I think from a perspective of allowing those conversations to be had and continue, obviously, yes, freedom of speech, say what you want, whatever you want to. However, Paul, some of the channels now have really almost became part of the state propaganda. And when I listened to this interview on USA Watchdog with this Warren Pollock, and the title of it itself, China, the New Nazis of Our Time. And when I listened to the entire interview, it was so much disinformation and just more so the propaganda of building the narrative for escalation with China, Paul.
Yeah, and that's been my concern for a long time. I mean, and to accuse China, I mean, we're led to believe that it's an out-and-out communist state, now I have to qualify this. There are, the difference between what you might term fascism and communism. There are certain traits where there's a crossover, and I've always said all isms are cabal, deep state constructs to divide and conquer humanity, and the origins of these sort of isms proves that point. Communism being a Western construct that was exported to Russia via the Russian Revolution to obviously to effectively control Russia and ensure that it never was a productive nation for decades until, ironically, the overthrow of communism and sort of more of the integration of Russia over the subsequent now on 30 years or so. But in terms of making accusations that China is some Nazi state is ridiculous, and it also for me highlights a very disturbing aspect, because many of the sort of core aspects of what you would call fascism or a fascist state actually sadly is very applicable to the US itself, because if you look at it, what's the one thing, fascist nations tend to have all this very patriotic chest pumping kind of approach, and there's a big emphasis on flags, and we have to be seen to be waving flags everywhere in public displays and having this very sort of overt sort of promotion of the state. There's also often, people will go, well, with regards to fascist states, there's a complete lack of recognition of human rights. So because they have this inbred thing where they try to export this idea of the bogeyman and everyone's our enemy and we have to protect our nation, well, that's exactly what the US does all the time. They then persuade people in the likes of the US that, we don't need to worry about human rights in these cases because it's a need, it's national security. So we can go in and stomp around other nations and do whatever we like, however we like, directly or indirectly via, proxies. And therefore, on that basis, people get desensitized in nations and then go, well, actually, we sort of approve of this approach, and we don't have an issue with things like, Guantanamo is a complicated subject. Now, I'm not trying to trivialize it, but there's a great example where no one seems to have a problem. There's people being locked up there for decades, or over a decade in many cases, with nothing happening. That people know they're being tortured, they know there's water, but people don't seem to have a problem with that, and that's another sort of component of what a fascist state does. Another classic identification of that is this constant scapegoating enemies, nations. Is it China? Is it Russia? It's Iran. It's Venezuela. It's all these nations, and people are kind of rallied with this patriotism because we have to eliminate this perceived threat there. And what we've seen during the Trump administration, because of the trade war, is this escalation in anti-Chinese sentiment in the US, which is completely unjustified. But it's a way, again, as I said, of identifying a scapegoat. And we know the reality of why there are problems with China, and it's got nothing to do with, in reality, all the reasons given for the trade war. The truth of the matter is, the US made a decision at some point to export its manufacturing base to China, but there's a lot of US companies doing perfectly well in China as a result of it, but no one's ever discussing that. But it's more to do with the fact China refuses to acquiesce to being bullied by the dollar and by the United States. That's ultimately the problem. Another classic trait of fascist nations is this supremacy of the military. They don't do anything to deal with. Look, how many times have we said this? The US should stop spending $750 billion on its military and actually spend the money at home and resolve infrastructure problems. And we know there's widespread issues in the US that need resolving, but no, the military is given this ridiculous amounts of government funding, and that's another case of fascism. It is you kind of exalt the military and put them into this position of this exalted status to justify why we need to spend the money. And it's back to this: we need to, because we're protecting the US people from a threat that's apparently thousands of miles away and has never launched a single attack in the US on anyone. The other one that was very common in fascist nations, but also you can argue in any of these controlled nations, so is controlling the mass media. I mean, in some nations, it's very overtly controlled by the government, but whatever you perceive the government to be. But in other cases, the media is indirectly controlled, and you have, this kind of government censorship of the media and this kind of idea, well, we can't discuss this because it's a matter of national security. Well, I'm sorry, that happens in the US as well. You have obsession with national security. Oh, we have all these horrendous, hostile powers like China, Russia, and all the ones we've said. And that's a way of justifying the action the US takes abroad, because it makes people believe, well, they're doing it to protect us, though they actually care for us as US citizens, which of course they don't. But that's another example of a fascist state without any doubt. The other one is obviously corporate power and how that is protected. And in fact, you have, as we said, a merging of state and corporation. So it's this mutual beneficial relationship between the pseudo government and business, and the deep state or whatever you want. That is another classic example of fascism. The other thing you have is often suppression of workers' rights. So we've seen the destruction of unions across many Western nations. So obviously in that case, people no longer have any protection. So labor authorities are often very either completely eliminated, which has happened a lot in the UK, for example, or they really are pretty limited in any way they can protect workers' rights. Fascism, which not only just fascism, but fascism is this absolute corruption and cronyism. They're always governed by groups of people who have these connections. Hence, what do we have? We have Bush Senior and Bush Junior becomes president. And in between, we have Clinton. And then we have obviously also Obama, but as I made the statement once, we had the potential for 4 out of the last 5 presidents being husband and wife and father and son. Well, that's another classic case of this. And of course, what we see is all this cronyism with who was in government positions, and that's another example. And of course, fraudulent elections. And there's no doubt in Western nations, and the US is an example. I mean, there has been clearly fraudulent elections. I don't doubt Trump, for example, won by a far bigger majority than he actually ended up apparently winning. And then we had all that debacle with Bush Jr. in Florida, which is just absolutely farcical.
Right.
So
right.
I'm sorry to say, but a lot of these things that they're just examples. A lot of these situations where nations are being accused of things, I'm sorry, but Western nations are far more complicit of doing these things. And like I say, I'm not, in no way, shape or form is China communist. China was, why do you would take 800 million people out of poverty? Why would you have a growing and middle class in China with a huge improvement in people's quality of life? That is a statement of fact. The other problem we now have is where we used to have government and mainstream media pumping us with ideas. The mainstream media is now hammering the same point, and everybody's now just takes it as read. It's like when you say things 1,000 times, it becomes an established fact. So the things like Xinjiang and apparently all these, how they're torturing people is just not true. And all this organ harvesting of people in China simply just isn't true. And it goes on and on and on. And the worst aspect of this is it's poisoning the narrative in the mainstream media, which isn't good, because people, in the alternative media, because people want to seek the truth from sources other than the mainstream. But ultimately, the damage this is doing to US-Chinese relations in the process is incalculable. And as I've said all along, whether the US likes, loathes, or somewhere in between China, the worst thing they can ever do is make enemies of them and alienate them. the US meddling in Hong Kong, which is an entirely separate subject, and which is absolutely self-evident that that's been the case. And is another example where the US will make accusations against nations and accuse them of doing things when they're the ones behind it, and in fact the ones guilty of doing the very things they accuse. Maduro's another great example where they'll say, well, Maduro's responsible for why people are starving to death in Venezuela. No, it's because of US sanctions. It's the same with people in Cuba have an horrendous quality of life. Yes, because of US sanctions for decades, and the list goes on. But people going in the alternative media and making these unsubstantiated statements and then now suggesting China's in fact, effectively a Nazi is, well, where's the basis of substance for that? It's just ways of terrifying people in the US that now not only is Russia the problem, but now apparently China is, and China's even a worse problem than Russia. And the question is, this is all a gigantic deflection from the internal problems the US has. And again, that's something nations do. They'll deflect all their internal problems and make it appear that everyone else is the problem, and they're the ones causing all our problems. And we have to go out on the world stage and take whatever measures we need to defend our national interest and our national security, to the point that everything now in the US has become a matter of national security when it has no relevance to it.
Yeah. Paul, great points, and you're completely right. It's completely, asinine for the type of discussion in regards to China, the new Nazis of our time. It's equivalent to me of Paul that we always have to have the boogeyman, right? It was ISIS, it was Al Qaeda, and it appears now for the state it's China. China's now the new boogeyman. And when you think of all these things through this interview that this Warren Pollock gives, he fails to completely do any type of internalizing in regards to where we are in the United States, whether it's the mass surveillance, whether it's the tiered justice system or unjust system that we have here in the United States, and we continue to see that on a daily basis. And you also stated out perfectly the fact that many of these corporations, they took advantage. They made a choice in regards to the intellectual property. And if China has an agreement that when you come there that they need to understand how this technology works, whatever it is, those company owners make that decision. That's them agreeing to those terms and conditions and to operate in China. So it's their decision to do that in hopes of whether it's regulations or it's labor, getting out of, at one time, very difficult working situations with American unions, all of these situations that have occurred. And to play now the victim card of, poor us, and look at these things that we led. The last time that I've looked at any type of map or any type of military involvement or regime changes, I don't necessarily see China at the forefront of that, Paul. I have more, and there's even a recent coup that just happened again recently, and these things happen time and time again. So and that's why I was very frustrated when I started listening to this interview. It's like, oh my gosh, if I want to get state propaganda, I'll turn on my TV. We used to go to YouTube to get good information, and it's far and few and in between now.
Well, I think the thing is, it's become a situation where we're now in the blame game, because the truth is Trump knows full well the economy is floundering. He knows it's the weakest economy the US has had in history and in reality. And the problem is they picked a fight with China, thinking China would just roll over because nations always roll over with the US, but they picked on the wrong nation. And China's quite happy to sit it out and do absolutely nothing if needs be, because in the end, they're going to lose far less than the US loses, has been proved. No one wins in a trade war, but the US is losing far more by this trade war, and they should never have entered it. We said from the day one it was the most stupid thing Trump could have done. But the problem is, because if the Chinese had rolled over, we wouldn't have had all this anti-Chinese propaganda now. They would have just gone, oh yeah, okay, China's done, it's got back in its box, it's behaving itself. we don't need to continue. Because China didn't, then we had the demonization of China. And here's the point: where were all the other US administrations complaining about China in the past? Nowhere. Because there wasn't anything for them to really complain about. It's just because of the acute economic situation, the geopolitical situation, the dumping of the dollar, China rejecting the dollar, by all the things we've said before, buying up assets all over the world and dumping dollars and treasuries in the process, that now it's the endless demonization, and it's become a demonization of China on every front. It's like all the nonsense said about their economy and about what's actually going on in China. And a question I'd like to ask of all these people, I'm not saying they haven't, but how many of them have even been to China in their lives? I mean, that's the first question.
Right.
I'd say, well, when were you last there? When have you been there? When have you observed things, with your own eyes and seen the reality? But the problem is, Trump's dug a hole for himself with China, and now they can't, because China's not back down. They're trying to find other ways to try and make China back down. So, for example, Hong Kong's the great example, because what they were hoping to see in Hong Kong was, after a week or two, China to roll in with the military, crack down. The world would have said, and they said, look, this is what China does to people who protest, because the world's buying the nonsense that these people are protesters when they're agitators. I mean, they're committing barbaric acts of criminality. They've injuring. I mean, there was an incident of I think it was only yesterday, or maybe there's footage of it yesterday, maybe the day before that, where they poured petrol on someone and set fire to them because they don't agree with the protesters' stance. So these people are not protesters, but the US wants to portray to everyone, and everyone's buying it. People in the alt media are buying that these Hong Kong people are all oppressed and they're rising up against China, which of course is nonsense. But the thing is, the US wants to do this, but China's going to sit it out and go, we're not going to send the military in, because that's exactly what you think we should do, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to give you the opportunity to demonize us on the world stage and say, look, this is how China deals with people who protest. Even though when it suits them, Hong Kong's part of China, and when it doesn't, then it doesn't. But that's a classic example. They come out with all this nonsense about China's aggression in the South China Sea. Well, with all due respect, what is the US doing in the South China Sea itself? I mean, how many thousands of miles? But this is the thing: everything is the US's business. But anyone else, if it's on their doorstep, it's not of their business. And this demonization is getting worse and worse and worse. But ultimately, it's not going to affect. It's not, if they think it's going to upset the Chinese people, it isn't, because the Chinese people know it's nonsense and won't accept it. If they think they're going to win out by doing what they're doing in Hong Kong, it's not going to work. But the problem is that the biggest mistake the US is making is they didn't learn from the trade war that China will never back down. China will just dig in and do nothing. And if the US won't agree to a sensible trade war settlement, then they'll just say, okay, well, we'll sit out for another 10 years. We'll sit out for 100 years if we really have to, because we don't care. Because do you know what we'll do in the process? We'll just have import substitution. We'll go and strike some trade deals, which they're doing on a daily basis and weekly basis. And that's something the US is trying to sell to the world, that you can't trust China because they'll stab you in the back and they'll rip you off with loans. What does the US think the IMF has been doing to nations for decades? It's that same kind of nonsense where it's, we don't behave this way when actually we do, but we'll accuse everyone else of doing that. And that's part of this propaganda. And I'm sorry to say, but the people in the US who buy this and buy all this propaganda are going to be in for the biggest shock of their lives when reality hits home. And I think what alt media should be doing, like we're trying to do, is present the reality and say to people, look, the US is in big trouble. It has enormous economic, geopolitical, it has social and internal affairs that it's not dealing with. And I come back to the point, why are we not seeing alt media channels going, you've spent trillions of dollars blowing the rest of the world up and intimidating it. Why didn't you spend that money at home? Where's those discussions? Where's the alt media covering FASAB 56? Where's the alt media covering all these things, all the things we've discussed in the past with Trump's executive orders? We talk about it. I don't hear anyone else talking about it. So they're selectively deciding they're going to back Trump at any cost in his administration. And actually, they're also feeding the frenzy between Democrats and Republicans, which, of course, is a deep state cabal construct. So they're not actually doing anyone any favors. They should be neutral, like we do. Sit in the middle, observe what's going on, and be objective in our assessment, because the objectivity is the only way the American people have a hope of being able to get through what's going to happen, because there's no magic wand. That's the other thing. It's the magic wand elements of the alt media who just tell everyone to sit at home, don't do anything, don't think about anything, because someone else has got all of this in hand, which, of course, after 3 years of a Trump presidency, proves is absolutely not the case. So, there are aspects of the interview where there is, there's some reality with regards to things that are going on in the US. But the characterization of China the way it is wholly unhelpful, and in fact does nothing to actually further the what I would call the normalization of US foreign affairs, and how they're going to start to sit with nations and agree to reach an amicable compromise. This is why China goes around the world and everyone wants to sign trade deals with them, wants to be part of the Belt and Road, wants to take part in win-win situations, because they know it's mutually beneficial. Where are all these nations knocking on Trump's door saying, let's sign deals? None of them. I mean, there isn't one single deal yet that Trump has signed of any substance. There's all these, we've signed some sort of peculiar agreement with the European Union, which never came to pass. We've signed this new NAFTA agreement. Well, where's that? We're going to crush China into oblivion, and they'll agree to our terms for the trade war. Well, that's never happened. The list goes on and on. The US has signed no meaningful trade deals with anyone, and yet in the 3 years Trump's been president, China just goes, and Russia for that matter, the two demon nations on the world, everyone seems to want to cooperate and work with them. And the question I ask is, where's the alt media covering those stories? Where's the alt media going, well, why are these nations, why is everyone wanting to work with them? So it's this constant, but you know what, I just think it's not about, too often now, it's not about facts. It's just about, it's sensationalism. It's what sells, it's what gets people to listen, rather than dealing with factual information that says, well, that's not the reality of what goes on in China or what goes on in Russia. And I've said all along, China might be a totalitarian, single party state, as people like to refer to it. But the one thing is, they don't have all this bullshit politics where one side says we're doing it, the other says no, and they all pretend to hate each other, and then they go and sit in a bar somewhere and laugh at how stupid people are to believe it. The difference is, in China, when they want to do something, the Chinese government, they just say, right, we've got a 50-year plan and we're rolling it out. We're going to make hundreds of millions of people and take them out of poverty, and they just get it done, because they don't have all this bullshit kabuki theater getting in the way of policies. And I made a tweet today, and this is Western politics. It's 65%, how what you say, and 30% how you look. And I was very generous saying it's 5% what you do. But everybody in the West just focuses on the 5%, which is probably literally 0.5%. Whereas in China, it's all about what they do. It's not what they look like, what they ever say. The Chinese people's attitude is, what are you doing? Are you delivering on your promises? Because the truth is, the Chinese government would collapse if they just sat back and did what the US has done to the American people. It would never survive. But the US real government, the deep state, has survived for decades, and nothing's changed. And just because Trump's president, tell me, I can't see anything material at this point that's changed. There's all these promises of white knights coming over the hill and all these investigations. Well, as yet, they've unearthed nothing. They've not seen a single arrest of anybody significant. And I'm not talking about Obama and people like that, because they're insignificant. You might be president, but presidents are insignificant. They're just a puppet to do what the deep state wants them to. Let's see some real deep state players being held accountable, then start believing it. But that's the other thing. Everyone's being conditioned by the alt media to believe that if you remove the Democrats, you solve the problem. The Democrats are the deep state. When you get rid of those, America's a great place and we'll all be fine and there won't be a problem. And that is now becoming largely an established fact in people's minds. And it couldn't be any more incorrect. So I'm sorry, but this is, we're going sort of quite long-winded in this, but I think there's a lot of interesting points that say the alt media is being irresponsible in how it reports things in general.
Yeah, Paul, we've had this discussion a few times, and for first-time listeners, and then also for our Gadfly subscribers, they may be asking the question, why? Why did we select to do this? We have discussed this numerous times in regards to other podcasts, other alt media that's out there in the background, and for far too long, we just idly watched it go by and didn't say anything. I've also went on Rogue News and did talk specifically about other alt media, and one of the things you said was very important, and that's conditioning. And we have been conditioned from the beginning of this. And if you think about it, if you really think long and hard about it in regards to the entire brainwashing and the conditioning that was involved, where blindly trust this administration, blindly follow and don't criticize. I remember I was one of the first to say, wait a minute, why are we saying where we go one, we all go? So you're saying that if there's an illegal war that somebody does, that we all go along regardless? And it was very interesting. The moment that anyone paused, or the moment that anyone criticized anything, they were quick to jump in and say, why are you dividing the Patriot movement? Why are you dividing us? You're an alt right wing person and everything. It's just, we have been so conditioned to just accept these things for so long. It's almost mental warfare what took place, to watch that following just blindly follow into any situation. And a couple of things real quick to kind of throw at you is that there was a big for the most part, there is no conservative group anymore in America, and that's what most people don't understand, is that, and any time that you criticize and say they're saying, oh, the economy is so great and everything else, but you can't question the spending, you can't question the amount of debt and the means that they're obtaining this, because you can't. They don't want to have those discussions on facts. They want to have those same discussions at one time they criticized 8 years ago. One last point to make real quick. It was very interesting because, we're not the only ones that are having this conversation. It was very interesting. I'll throw it up real quick because I just found out about this today, Paul. So I would have sent it to you earlier. But Matt Drudge shows a Drudge Report probably has one of the largest, followings. I can't remember how many. They're an aggregator, how many views that they get. It's just off the charts. But what people started noticing was that Matt Drudge had started, publishing more articles criticizing and questioning things. So on one of the Fox News shows, they actually had a whole episode asking the question of why Drudge was doing this, because they can't handle that criticism. They just think it's so wrong for anyone to do this. And this is just so dangerous. It's dangerous on so many parts. And we watched it happen that you couldn't question Obama because he was the savior and here to save, America. And it was wrong to do this. And those same thoughts are holding true with this next administration. And this is just kind of more proof that this is happening, where you're not allowed to criticize. You're looked at completely. What's wrong with you if you're opening criticizing? What are your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head, and it is. And this is the problem. I mean, are we living in some alt media dictatorship where no one's allowed to question the narrative of a group of people? Because, if you're going to be objective, I mean, I get people contacting me saying, it's clear you hate Trump and you wish he wasn't president. No, I'm just dealing objectively that he's not making a good job of doing X, Y, and Z. And these are the reasons, and it's constructive. The other thing that bothers me greatly, and we've had sort of discussions about this ourselves, everything now is characterized that in any way that that the state would help people or assist is socialism, and it's to be utterly thrown into the long run. We can't possibly have that. It's all social. It's not socialism. That is a way to condition people to believe that the state has absolutely no obligation to any of its citizens under any circumstances. Well, I hate to say it, but that's exactly what the cabal's attitude has been for decades with regards to all nations and those people. They don't feel they have any obligation. And I'm sorry, there are situations where people in the US and people in the UK, they do need to have a safety net and an umbrella, and it's nothing to do with socialism. That's called decency. That's called treating people with respect. I mean, look at what happens. It happens here. It happens in the US with ex-service personnel. How badly they're treated after everything they've been through. They're just thrown into the gutter. A lot of them end up homeless. There's huge opiate addiction and suicide rate, and all these nations have a right to look after these people. That is not socialism. And there are people with crippling health conditions. I mean, we can all be healthy one day. What happens if tomorrow we've worked hard all our lives, we become terminally ill, and we can't provide for ourselves and our families? What, we just throw the whole family on the street because someone became terminally ill? No. There are definitely boundaries with which we go too far in that, and I absolutely agree with that. But this blanket idea that anything involves helping people, assisting people, or providing any form of safety net is now being decried as utterly deplorable, frankly, is deplorable itself. And you don't have to have this phony capitalism on the one hand and pseudo-socialism on the other. You have to find the balance and find something that stimulates real capitalism, because we've never had that, and take aspects of socialism that work perfectly well and all states should operate, but not extremes. And everyone gets shoved to the extreme, and they never go, the true answers lie in the middle. But there has been a huge, well, for me at least, I've seen since the Trump administration came on, where socialism is applied to anything that the Trump administration don't like, or the people who vote Trump don't like, and it's an excuse to demonize. And some of these ideas are good, solid, positive ideas. Yeah, there's a lot of crack, lunatic ideas, but you discard those. But to say the state has no burden of responsibility for its citizens, and it's dog eat dog, and it's down to you to manage and get by. Well, here's the point: when the dollar implodes, people's whole way of life's destroyed. I'd like to see how many of these people who believe in that, when they're on the receiving end of it, let's see how much they're really keen on the idea that the state owes no obligation to its citizens under any circumstances. Because they'll be the first ones crying out for help and begging because they can't feed their family or whatever else may ensue or not ensue. That, I think, is highly destructive. And again, as we've said before, the worst thing about since the Trump administration came to office, I have never seen a more polarized nation between apparent different faux political parties as much as they exist. Yes, there was always Democrats, there was always Republicans, but I didn't see this vitriolic hatred for each other like we see now. I've never seen it. I don't know whether you'd concur with that, CJ, but for me, that is by design, and it's all a way of ultimately demonizing people, sections of society, to divide and conquer the American people, who should be all coming together, as should the alt media's responsibility, to bring everyone together and say, this isn't the problem, this isn't the problem, this is the problem. You're all focusing on the wrong thing. And if the alt media actually, instead of nailing its colors to either the Democrat or the Republican mask, instead nailed its colors to the mask of what humanity and the people of US or UK need, and what is good for and right for the people, that is when you will affect change. But when you fight the political system, and you are never going to prevail. You will never beat them, because that's what they want you to do. They want you to waste your time, your energy, and get sucked into this political partisan bullshit, because they know ultimately themselves you're just wasting your time. You're never going to affect change. Come into the middle of the room, identify where the real problem is, and nations like the US will transform itself very, very quickly. But until they do that, nothing is going to change, and you're going to be given all these false promises and false ideas that it's all going to change magically. And you know what? Even if they manage to destroy the Democrats, or the Democrats destroy themselves, that won't change anything. All that'll mean is you'll be stuck with a neocon presidency and neocon government for the next 30, 40 years, or however long, while the rest of the world's changing. And what do you really think those bunch of neocons are going to do for the American people? Because frankly, what have they ever done for the American people? Nothing.
Yeah.
All they do is go around asserting themselves, puffing their chest out on the world stage, bailing out banks, and making sure their crony financial system, their crony corporations, having flourish. That's all they're interested in. Behind closed doors, they laugh at the American people, and I'm telling you, this is fact. They go behind closed doors and laugh at the stupidity in their eyes of how they don't understand how the American people and the British people and Western nations still buy this crap. They are staggered, despite everything that people haven't worked out. Why is it everybody promises the earth and delivers absolutely nothing for decade after decade, but we still believe in this system? I don't understand how anyone believes in that system, but they do. They hold the people of the nation they supposedly represent with utter contempt. Yeah, they want you to go along to their cheerleading rallies and shout all the great things they want to hear. Well, they don't care about you. They're not interested in you. You're just a means to justify their existence, to do what they want to do, because they need the American people's, the British people's support on the world stage to do what they want to do. But ultimately, they don't care, and they do. They laugh in the face of all the people of their nations who they cannot believe still believe this nonsense. And too much of the alt media is just feeding this nonsense in a different way. And they're not addressing the real problems that the US faces, the UK faces. Stop feeding the beast that is there to make you look like idiots.
Yeah, very well said.
That's a harsh statement, but I'm sorry, it's true I'm not saying people are idiots, but they want you to believe in a system that makes you look like it. Stop feeding this ridiculous political system. It's happening now in the UK because we've got a general election on the 12th of December. So all this faux partisan politics nonsense comes out. It's all rubbish. Ultimately, it doesn't matter who you vote for, because nothing's going to change. And if you haven't worked that out by now, then ask yourself, how's my country fundamentally improving? Where am I seeing? I mean, Russia, we've seen fundamental improvements in the last decade and 20 years. China, fundamental improvements in the last decade and longer for the people. Better quality of life, better standard of life, better education. The list goes on and on. In Western nations, tell me how anything's improved since the financial crisis in 2008. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So why are you believing a system that absolutely does nothing for you?
Yeah.
Why?
Paul,
I don't know. I'm flabbergasted. I sit there at times scratching my head going, am I missing something? Because I don't understand why it's so difficult for people to comprehend. It's utter nonsense.
Well, I was, guilty as charged. I was there, 8-9 years ago in that, and it finally came to the realization that the same divide and conquer tactics that were deployed when, Obama launched it have just been, continued, in this administration. But you said something very important, and I think that if we would pause and realize, and it was a very interesting podcast I was listening to the other day, and it was specifically talking about this as well. Person that travels quite a bit and goes around different cities and everything, is that we are not as divided as a country as people think. There are a lot of good people helping, doing great things to help one another, humanity, and these controllers they want us to believe that it's about left and right and all these things. But if we just pause and we realize what humanity can become and help one another, we'd get so much more accomplished, instead of putting our faith and our belief in political resolution. That resolution has to come from the way that we treat each other, and if we don't start there, Paul, we're never going to solve those problems. We never are.
No, but you know what? We've said this before, and I do believe, but unfortunately, as we've said, the age of this demographic inside the US is getting older. Unsurprisingly, like, well, everyone's getting older, but there's a core and a backbone of American people who can drag America by its bootstraps into the 21st century and make it a great nation amongst equals. But they're getting older, and they're getting more beaten up by how the system's treated them. But my concern is that everyone's going to, when the US dollar collapses and we have this huge economic turmoil, the US people, instead of pulling together and going, hang on, they're going to go, the damn, oh, it's Trump's fault, it's the Trump administration, and Trump's going, it's the Fed. And then the Republicans are going to blame China, and it's just going to be this endless blame game instead of all the American people, or enough of them, saying, no, hang on, we're not going to tolerate this. We know you're the problem. This is the problem, and you're going to do something about it. And here's the question. We've always said this. The US loves nations to have protests where it's backing regime change, and it talks about them endlessly. And conversely, it never talks about them when they're in nations where actually there's a legitimate reason to protest. But the question's going to come: at what point do we see people in the US protesting in some meaningful way, and actually protesting about the things that truly matter? How's the US going to react to that? Are they just going to do we think that the US will just take it lying down and accept it? And this is their biggest fear. The biggest fear is that people in the US and the UK and nations wake up and go, no, you're the problem. We've realised now, and we're not going to put up with this and tolerate this. Then it's game over for them, because otherwise they're going to have to play their hand in a way that would cause massive uprisings, and they're never going to be prepared to do that. And that's it's just a simple bluff calling. If you call their bluff, it's game over. They don't have all this power. They've conditioned people to imagine, and that's the alt media has also given this impression. They're all powerful. You can't defeat them. They're this, they're that. They're nothing of the sort. They rely on the conditioning of the nation of people. But if the people for a split second went, we're not tolerating this anymore, it's over. It would finish in the blink of an eye, because they rely on the conditioning and the obedience of people to believe in the nonsense. And once that goes, it's over. And it's that simple. And I share your sentiments. There's a lot of great American people, and I include people, you're a good friend of Lisa and I know lots of other people, and there's great Americans, and that's why I talk about this, because I actually want America to be this great nation amongst equals, but it's not going the right way about it.
No.
And I'm not going to sit there and go, well, I'll just say that Trump's doing a great job, because that's what people want to hear. But at some point in the future, America will normalize. It will, because all things eventually do, and it will be this great nation. But it can make itself, that process, a lot easier if people didn't just grasp another belief system, because too much of the alt media has created this new belief system that isn't reality, and it's not actually resolving any of the fundamental problems that exist. So I'm sorry if people don't like what I'm saying, or get offended by it or upset, but it's reality. So how do you want to resolve the problems? Do we want to face reality, or just believe in something because it suits our particular disposition? Well, and that's what the alt media has done. Not all of it. There are some good people out there, and in fact, there's quite a lot of them, but they're largely silenced by people who just, parrot the Trump can't do any wrong. And if you say to the contrary, then you hate Trump. You're a socialist. You're a Democrat. You're this. You're that. You're an apologist for all these other things, and it's not reality. They're just characterizing you as an individual. You're not. And the other problem is, a lot of them are just repeaters.
Yep.
They come out with the same little sound bites that you hear in 1,000 other people. So that because they've been conditioned to believe things. The Trump hasn't failed completely as a president yet, and there may be time for things to change. But at the moment, he's not on the course that he was supposed to be on. And I'm not entirely blaming Trump, but how many times do we see people coming out characterizing Trump a certain way who were in his administration and now no longer on? Now, we could argue they're all just doing it because either they left or Trump fired them or something. But there is some substance to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the impeachment process, as much as a debacle it is. Why are all these individuals who are subpoenaed not turning up because the White House is telling them not to? That conveys an impression of guilt. Because if Trump's not done anything wrong, just go in and let's destroy the myth. Let's get 100 of these people going in and go, well, this is what happened. Mm-hmm. So what are you talking about? It's nonsense. It would end. But Trump, either because he's fearful of someone's going to say something, or maybe something happened that we're not aware of. But this doesn't convey a person who's innocent by this stonewalling investigation. I know the investigation shouldn't happen, but play the game. Let these people go and talk. Let these people tell the reality of what's happened, and it will bring an end to it. But all Trump's doing is feeding the process by refusing for people to cooperate. I mean, it's like people wanting his tax returns, and he's done everything to fight it. And again, it looks like he's losing the back. Well, why is he trying to hide his tax returns? What's he so fearful of? I don't think there's anything wrong with his tax return. I just don't think his tax returns reflect that people think has the status and the wealth necessarily that he has. That's why he's trying to hide.
Right.
I don't think he's broken a single law.
Right.
Absolutely not. But I think, if people go, hang on, but I thought you were this guy who, well, hang on, your tax returns don't reflect that. I mean, that's no, yeah, I could be totally
reality.
wrong.
No, I think you're right on.
That's the impression. And he's doing all these things that are feeding people's fear and concern about him. And, and he's being very impetuous at times and reckless in his policies. Well, we can sit there. I mean, CJ and I could eulogize over Trump and tell everyone it's wonderful and it's all changing. And then when things don't happen, people are going to come back and say, but hang on, you said all these things. But that's the other thing that bothers me. The alt media comes out with this stuff year after year after year. It never happened. And no one goes back and says to them, hang on, nothing you've said has actually ever transpired. Can you please account for the fact you don't? Well, at least with us, we make predictions, we make forecasts, and they actually happen. Things are actually happening that we've discussed a week ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years. And that really, at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do. We're here to make forecasts and predict things, discuss things, analyze things, and try to be as accurate as possible. But that's the other thing, make people in the alt media accountable. When they keep coming out with stuff and it doesn't happen, don't just sit back and go, well, it'll be manana. No, it'll be next week. Oh, well, maybe it'll be next month, or maybe it'll be in his next term of presidency. Make them accountable now and say what you're saying is not coming to pass. So I'm sorry, your track record for predictions is frankly non-existent. So why am I following you? Why am I listening to you? Why? Because there's a lot of people attracted to the alt media because they're terrified and they want to have hope in something, and they don't want to have hope in a system that means that the US dollar is going to collapse and there's going to be this huge turmoil globally as a result of it. No, they don't want to face that. They just want to believe that someone's going to wave a magic wand and it'll all be resolved. Well, that's not going to happen. Right. So is it better to face that reality now, or face it when the ton of manure is on your doorstep and you can't get out the house? What are you going to do? Reflect on the fact that for a long time people like us told you reality. Well, it's too late now. So just look at what's actually happening and start to be critical. I get enough people having a go at me for telling the truth, but I wonder how many times these other people, for endlessly making statements that aren't factually correct, get anybody criticizing them, because ironically they seem to have far bigger people following them than those of us who try to stick to truth and are correct in our assessments and forecasts about things. So, but again, that's the alt media responsibility. Just because it's alt media doesn't mean it's always factually correct or it's always objective. But people seem to think it is because, well, it's the antidote. It's it's taking the opposite stance that the mainstream media is about Trump, therefore it must be correct. Well, no, it's not. And some people are very correct and do things really well, and you know that's great. But those who don't need to be held accountable, because ultimately they're only serving their own interests by doing what they're doing, and they're not serving the interests of the people who need to be informed and have an objective viewpoint of things.
Very well said, Paul. Paul, for our first-time listeners and then also for our Gadfly subscribers, could you please go ahead and plug your website and your podcast as well, please?
Yeah, we obviously it's the seriousreport.com. We have free content, but obviously we have our podcast subscription series, which I think we've been doing over 3 years. We've got getting up for 800 episodes, which you can access every one. And we had our people who joined who actually listened to every one, which I think they deserved the Congressional Medal, I think.
It's nice. Very nice.
But we, you know, we have a track record of getting things right a long time before realities, you know, comes to pass, and we cover everything geopolitically, economically, finance, everything. And we're always topical. We always try to deal with events, but we also deal with future proofing, where we see things going. I mean, we had a big expose on the shale oil sector in January, and everything we said has subsequently come to pass. That's just one small example. And it's $4.75 a month. We keep it cheap because we believe that information like that, it should be accessible to everyone. I mean, yeah, you could make it much more expensive, but then you're restricting, because a lot of people can't afford it. And we make it cheaper because we believe that information should be available. But equally, we have to pay our bills as well, and we can't live on fresh air. So I know some people said you should release it all for free. Well, my argument to that is, well, do you work for free? Do you go out and work 40, 50 hours a week for nothing? No. So we all have our, you know, commitments. So, but we do, that's what we endeavor to do. And I think we have a very good track record, and you're a subscriber, CJ, so you know yourself what we do, and it's very detailed. It's very to the point. There's no waffle. And we just get to the nub of several events on a daily basis, and we dissect it and interpret things and present how we understand things are happening. And that's all we can do, is just to be objective and honest. And I don't care about any political parties or any entities. I'm not interested. I'm interested in truth. I'm interested in the reality of what's unfolding and presenting that. And if it's unpalatable, it's unpalatable. But then, I'd look forward to the day when we say, well, it's all over, the world's going to start normalizing, and all these great things are going to happen, and then we'll all pack our bags because we'll be redundant.
Yeah.
So, exactly. But that'll be a great day, because that's what we all aspire and we want to see.
Absolutely. And also want to thank our Gadfly subscribers. This has been a free content production out there for the public. And also for the first-time listeners to the Gadfly, I'm very honored and humbled to work with such a talented group of contributors and putting together just some absolute fabulous content. So if this is the first time you're catching one of the Gadfly multi-channel networks broadcasts, you can check us out over again at the gadfly.vhx.tv. And again, our contributors, just a great team. We have Dr. Jim Willey, Dr. Paul. We also have Ken Shortgun Jr., Roy Hall, and again, just great roundtable discussions. In my humble opinion, it's probably the best group of contributors brought together. And there's times when there's opposing views, and I think that's healthy through conversation. And so please consider also checking out our work over at the gadfly.vhx.tv. Paul, thank you for a great discussion, and we'll do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you. And also a plug, because CJ's a great host and he's a wonderful person, and he glues the whole team together. And without him, we'd be a lot poorer as a result of that. So hats off to CJ too.
Thank you for your kind words, Paul.